This first panel is entitled Free Speech and Campus Culture. Our moderator is Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, John Gore, whom I have previously introduced. In the order in which they will be presenting, our panelists are Eugene Volokh, Heather McDonald, Robert Shibley, and Lee Tyner. Professor Eugene Volokh teaches First Amendment law and a First Amendment clinic at the UCLA School of Law. He's the author of 2 textbooks, as well as over 75 law review articles. Many of you will recognize him as the founder and co-author of The Volokh Conspiracy, a weblog that is now hosted at Reason Magazine. Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal and a New York Times best-selling author. A recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize, she's the author of several books, and her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, and the New Criterion. Robert Shibley is the executive director of the Foundation for Civil Rights in Education, known as FIRE. During his 15-year career at FIRE, Mr. Shibley has aided students and faculty members at hundreds of colleges and universities and has personally traveled to dozens of campuses to educate students, faculty, and administrators about First Amendment issues. Lee Tyner was named the inaugural general counsel at Texas Christian University earlier this year. Before joining the leadership team at TCU, Mr. Tyner served as a lawyer for the University of Mississippi for nearly 20 years. While at Ole Miss, he helped spearhead the effort to revise all campus policies that affect free expression so that the University of Mississippi earned a green light with respect to free expression from FIRE. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here today. We appreciate your time. Please note that our panelists on both panels today will be taking audience questions at the end of their presentations. We ask that you please write your questions on the cards provided at your chair. Someone will be around to collect them. With that, John, thank you. The panel is yours.
We are going to allow each of our panelists 7 to 10 minutes for some opening remarks, and we'll start with Professor Volokh.
Thank you very much for having me. This is a subject that is near to my heart, partly because I'm a First Amendment professor. That's what I do. I teach a clinical class on it. Partly because I'm a professor and I care about universities, and partly I like to think because I'm an American, and this is something that all of us should care about. And part of the reason is just how deep the danger goes. It's not just speech codes enforced against drunken partiers at a university. It's not just as some people would have it, well, we need to suppress the Nazis. You know, I have no interest in furthering the speech of Nazis for obvious reasons, but it's never just about the Nazis. So I want to give a few illustrations here, and in the course of that talk a little bit about both the First Amendment issues, and sometimes they're not First Amendment issues. Sometimes they're issues of academic freedom that go beyond simple First Amendment principles that are raised in these examples. So this is a flyer for a panel in January 2015 at the University of Minnesota. And heading is, "Can one laugh at everything? Satire and free speech after Charlie." This is after the Charlie Hebdo multiple murders in Paris. And the flyer includes the iconic, now iconic cover of Charlie Hebdo after the killings, with a picture, pictures someone's supposed to be Muhammad. Obviously, we don't know that's what Muhammad looked like for obvious reasons, with a tear from his eyes and "Je suis Charlie" at the bottom. And it's in small print, but you'll see that the panel members, these are the substantive people. This isn't some rabble-rouser invited because of his controversiality. This is law professors, anthropology professors, a journalism professor, professor of French and Italian, and the editorial cartoonist for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. So the panel went on, but here's what happened. Some students and others found this flyer offensive. I take it because they perceived it as blasphemous. Well, that's going to happen at universities. People find things offensive. But what happened is there was a complaint filed with the Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action Office, claiming that this created a hostile environment based on religion and therefore violated the university policies, presumably could lead to discipline for the tenured faculty members who were organizing this. Obviously, students should be just as protected as tenured faculty members, but if the students, it seems to me, pretty clearly get a message, if even the faculty members are not immune from this, imagine what would happen if we were to put on something like this. So in any event, the director started an investigation, defended ultimately in public her decision to start the investigation, saying there are limits on free speech, and that would be where you have harassment of an individual based on their identity. Note, there actually wasn't any individual targeted in this case. It's not any. There are occasional cases involving somebody personally criticizing a particular student, let's say, or a particular faculty member. Even that should be protected speech, but that clearly wasn't involved here. Nonetheless, that's how the director labeled this. In the end, the investigation concluded the flyer does not rise to the level of discriminatory harassment, but found that because many people found the poster personally offensive and hurtful, contributed to an atmosphere of disrespect toward Muslims, and that the director recommended to the dean that he communicate that the college doesn't support the flyer's image of the depiction of Muhammad.
Professor Volokh, can I ask you to speak a little bit more
Yes.
into the microphone?
Yes, absolutely. To his credit, as best I could tell, the dean never communicated this because it's none of his business to communicate universities' or colleges' view on depictions of Muhammad. Yes, this is a criticism in some measure of particular strands within Islam. It might be offensive to particular people who have particular religious views within the Muslim tradition. That's been the nature of religious debate for centuries in the West, where people criticize, often quite sharply and immoderately, religious beliefs, whether it be Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or Jewish or whatever else. That is a necessary part of the university, yet the university, the administrator herself, seemed to be doing what she could to try to deter such speech in the future. So this is a cover of a book by one George Gowrich, who is a professor at Baylor. And the man on the cover is Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. And it's called The Young Ataturk, From Ottoman Soldier to Statesman of Turkey. Very serious scholarly book. Gowrich is an award-winning military historian. So he is invited by the Middle Eastern Studies Department at Cal State Northridge to give a talk on his book. And the talk is shouted down by extremist Armenian activists. Obviously, Armenians have a lot of grievances with regard to the Turks, but they decided that even though Ataturk was not accused of being mastermind behind the killings of the Armenians during World War I, he was insufficiently soft on all that and was part of this Turkish campaign of denial of the killings of the Armenians, and they shouted it down, basically stopped the speech from happening. And they proudly announced this online. Our presence will send a clear message that college and campuses are not incubators for denialists, here denials of the killing of the Armenians, and treating them as breeding grounds for Turkish nationalist ideology is offensive for the Armenian students who attend these colleges. Now, if somebody had raised this in the Q&A afterwards, or had leafleted outside saying, look, this person is praising Ataturk, the biography, I think, was in some measure positive, but here are all the things that Ataturk and the Turks did that are bad, and here's what you should take into account, that would have been great academic debate. That's not what they did. They deliberately denied this award-winning scholar the opportunity to speak, and denied the audience the opportunity to listen. And again, if this can happen on a subject like this, on what subject could it not happen? Let me also just step back a bit. I don't know how many people here are students of World War I era history, and in particular in that theater. I am certainly not. I cannot claim any serious reading on what happened to the Armenians in 1915 in the Ottoman Empire. Was it in fact a genocide deliberately targeting a particular ethnic group, in part based on their religion? The Muslim Ottoman Empire was fighting at the time. The Christian Russians and the Armenians were seen by some as being Christian, being kind of in sympathy and in support of the Russians. Was it just the vicissitudes of war? Was it a series of massacres that don't rise to the level of genocide? Interesting questions. And if we want to figure out the answer to those questions, either we do the research ourselves, or we look
Just as a practical matter, we look to what the community of scholars says about these kinds of things and look to see what the dominant view is. Dominant view is sometimes wrong, but that's the way the smart money bets. This is the normal way that we consume scholarship, by looking at the conventional wisdom, the broad consensus in a particular scholarly community. But that consensus is only trustworthy when we know that faculty members and scholars generally are free to argue this. The moment one side of the debate, and by the way, Gurevich is not even somebody who actually thinks that the killings of the Armenians didn't happen, although he seems to be not as strong on that as the protesters might have liked. But the moment we know that one side is being suppressed, we can't trust the other side. The only way we can trust, even tentatively trust, the scholarly consensus is if we know that it can be constantly challenged. And once the challenges are blocked, then the dominant view becomes suspect as well. Let me mention one other example, and there's some others we can talk about. This is actually something that came down just a couple of weeks ago, from the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. This was an appeal of a complaint about alleged anti-Semitism at Rutgers. The exact dispute there had to do with whether particular people were required to pay $5 for entry to an event because they were perceived as Jewish, something that is really quite tangential to what was announced in this case. This is the case in which the decision adopted the State Department definition of anti-Semitism as including, among other things, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, applying double standards to Israel, and drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And this in a context of deciding what could lead to withdrawal of federal funds under Title VI, what could potentially lead to lawsuits against universities. So this is a legal document which adopted this definition. Now, the document is vague, perhaps purposefully so, but the message seems pretty clear that if universities allow this kind of speech, they could be subject to investigation, to loss of funds, to lawsuits, and the like. Now, I'm Jewish myself. I'm a supporter of Israel, not of everything that Israel does, but on balance, I think it's a lot better than all the other countries in the area. But obviously, universities have to be places where people could talk about whether Jewish people have the right to self-determination. Not all people are broadly accepted to have rights of self-determination. Maybe nobody should. Maybe it's not a matter of right. Maybe it's a matter of politics. Certainly lots of people, myself probably included, aren't convinced that the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination in the sense of having a separate nation. But even if you are very firm on that, what about the Northern Cypriots? What about the Catalonians? What about the Taiwanese? What about the Tibetans? Interesting question. I mean, I suppose somebody could say every ethnic group that defines itself as an ethnic group has a right to independence and a right to state that it runs on ethnic principles. Far from obvious. That is the very sort of thing that universities should be debating. Likewise, I think comparing the Israelis and Nazis is ridiculous, but it's the kind of ridiculous that needs to be responded to rather than suppressed. And likewise, if you have the government going after people on the theory that they're applying double standards, it's very hard to imagine there'll be anything but a double standard in the application of such a vague and ill-defined rule. So these are very serious problems and very serious threats to speech, very serious threats to the academic enterprise more broadly. And I'm very glad that the Justice Department has been looking into them and has been stepping in on the sides of the speakers.
Thank you. Robert? I'm sorry. We'll go now to Heather McDonald, but before her remarks, I just want to mention one other fact about Heather. She has published a book about this topic called The Diversity Delusion, and is very well regarded in this area, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gore. Today I'm going to make two contrarian arguments. First, that unfettered debate is not the core function of higher education, however useful such debate is. And second, that the assault on free speech is not the greatest problem facing universities today, however dangerous that assault on free speech is. But first, let me state some core principles. Trying to silence speech with which you disagree, whether by institutional fiat, by shouting over the speaker, or by mob violence, is the start of a terrifying descent towards a world in which brute power rules. Anyone who can watch windows being smashed and the sucker punching of ideological opponents, usually Trump supporters, without feeling foreboding at these hallmarks of 1930s fascism, is in deep denial. The resort to brute force in the face of disagreement is particularly disturbing in a university which should provide a model for civil discourse. The anti-fascist moniker adopted by those who use violence to silence speech is stunningly ironic. A Facebook post from, quote, "We students of color at the Claremont colleges" announced grandiosely that, quote, "As a community, we cannot and will not allow fascism to have a platform. We refuse to have McDonald's speak," end quote. That would be me. And these are the people who claim to be against hegemonic power? Students' ignorance of the role of free speech in a free society tells us yet again that our educational system is failing miserably. These self-righteous censors claim that free speech is a weapon to further oppress minorities. Tell that to Frederick Douglass, who in 1860 wrote that slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South. It is also remarkable that the proponents of censorship, many of them professors, are unable to engage in the most abstract reasoning, understanding that a precedent once set applies across a range of situations. The campus silencers may currently monopolize the power to define hate speech, but do they really want that power in the hands of their arch enemy, Donald Trump? They also demonstrate a lack of confidence in their own arguments and in the power of reason and persuasion. So-called progressives fiercely oppose, for example, Steve Bannon's ideas. You would think that they would eagerly welcome the opportunity to discredit those ideas in a public forum. Instead, The New Yorker recently caved into pressure to disinvite Bannon from what was going to be a hard-hitting interview with its editor, and the faculty at the University of Chicago are trying to scuttle a debate between Bannon and a business professor there. In silencing Bannon, they are in effect silencing their own best arguments. Now, in understandable outrage against this sometimes violent close-mindedness, conservative defenders of free speech have been claiming that the debating of opinion is the very essence of education. It is not. The essence of education is this: cramming as much knowledge into the empty noggins of students as a mere 4 years will allow. For most of that knowledge, the Socratic or dialogic model of education is simply irrelevant. It makes no sense for a student to say, "I have an opinion about the laws of thermodynamics, but I'm willing to listen to other views," or "I have an opinion about German case endings, but I'll keep an open mind towards dissent." There exists a bedrock of facts and ideas that students should simply absorb in humility and gratitude. They would include, at a bare minimum, the events that led to the creation of the nation-state in Europe, the achievements of Greco-Roman civilization, familiarity with key works of Shakespeare, Twain, Dickens, and Swift, among others, an understanding of genetics and the functioning of neurons, and the philosophical basis for constitutional democracy, among hundreds of other essential strata of human geology. Moreover, the dialogic model of education currently embraced by conservatives has a presentist focus. It tends ineluctably towards current affairs, which should be the last on the list of things that education concerns itself with. The issues about which students are going to have the strongest opinions concern current political and policy matters. Is Donald Trump a fascist? Which bathrooms should trans individuals use? The fact that only one answer to those questions is acceptable on college campuses is indisputably a problem, but they are not the questions that undergraduate education should focus on. There will be time enough after students graduate to debate current affairs. College is a precious opportunity to plunge into the splendors of the past, for which the time is already too short. But my vision of a pure ivory tower education is sadly probably not realistic. So if we could assure that dissenting voices from the reigning political orthodoxies were allowed onto campus, would that cure the deepest malaise there? It would not. Censorship is the natural result of the paramount mission of today's university, assigning guilt and innocence within the ruthlessly competitive hierarchy of victimhood. Almost the entire university has been taken over by a single idea, that to be a minority, a female, or one of the ever-multiplying varieties of non-binary genders in America is to be the target of endless, life-threatening bigotry. That bigotry is particularly acute, we are to believe, on college campuses. Minority and female students are being taught to believe that they are quite literally under existential threat. UC Berkeley's Division of Equity and Inclusion until recently hung banners throughout campus reminding students of the contemporary university's paramount mission, assigning guilt and innocence within the ruthlessly competitive totem pole of victimhood. One banner showing a female Black and a male Hispanic student read, "Create an environment where people other than yourself can exist." After Yale students mobbed a highly respected sociologist for 3 hours, screaming things like, "F you are disgusting," and "we are dying" at him, Yale's president said he'd never been so proud of his students, and Yale conferred a racial justice prize on 2 of the most aggressive participants. As long as this ideology of victimhood remains the dominant narrative on college campuses, the movement to suppress ideas that challenge that narrative will remain overpowering. We can invoke John Stuart Mill all we want, but it's not going to make a darn bit of difference. Taught by a metastasizing campus diversity bureaucracy to see bias where none exists, students will continue to equate non-conforming ideas with hate speech, and hate speech with life-threatening conduct that should be punished, censored, and repelled with force if necessary. It therefore becomes imperative to rebut the victimology narrative. It is not enough to call for freedom of expression. That is, if I may borrow a term, a relatively safe stance to take. Even many liberals will back you up. No, if we're going to restore harmony and civil sanity, we are going to have to take on the victim ideology directly and assert that racism and oppression are not the predominant characteristics of American society and colleges today. For all the sins of our past, and they are real and egregious, there has never been a more tolerant, opportunity-filled polity than our present one. Who will make those arguments? Not college presidents, not the complicit or cowed faculty, and certainly not the diversity bureaucrats. It is incumbent on the rest of us to speak out against the myth of endemic bias and to remind students that they are the most privileged human beings in history by dint of having at their fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, knowledge. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll hear now from Robert Schubert.
All right, great. Thank you. Hopefully we'll get some slides up in a moment. I want to start with a story that's similar to some of the ones that Eugene have talked about. The story of an undergraduate at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, named Keith John Sampson. He's 58. He's putting himself through school as a janitor, working there, and he had a assigned break time. So one day he sat down in the break room of his school to read a book, and the name of that book was Notre Dame versus the Klan: How the Fighting Irish Defeated the Ku Klux Klan. And it's a historical account of how the anti-Catholic KKK came to Notre Dame's campus in 1924 and how the student body confronted it, sending the message they didn't share the Klan's values. On the cover of the book was a picture of a KKK cross burning, superimposed onto the Notre Dame campus. Apologies.
No, it's all right. You can use my slides if you want.
Okay, I guess mine aren't up there. All right, unfortunately for Mr. Sampson, a coworker saw him reading the book silently and to himself and reported him to the university for harassment. And without a hearing, he was deemed guilty of the charge and suspended from campus. My organization, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, came to his aid. And after several months of advocacy, he was allowed back on campus to continue his education. And the reason I bring up this incident, which happened as far back as 2007, is because it's just one of the hundreds of examples of cases and there you go, in which college students and faculty members were punished for expressing or even just holding unpopular viewpoints. So I want to use that to start highlighting the long-standing nature of this problem, and second, to point out that the culture of respect for controversial expression on campus has become so threadbare that students, faculty members may face punishment based on the subjective reaction of a person who literally judged a book by its cover. FIRE annually reviews the written policies at approximately 450 of the nation's top institutions of higher education. And according to our most recent report, 90.9% of them have at least one written policy that either directly infringes on the free speech rights of students or is written broadly enough to allow campus administrators to do so. As I believe one of the attorney generals mentioned earlier, about 33% to 40%, depending on how you look at it, have policies that prevent speech in such a way that it's what we would consider to be very obviously and tragically unconstitutional. And so we've over the years documented hundreds of examples of censorship of students on campus. And so we've been seeing lately, particularly in the academic quarter, this criticism that these actually aren't that big a deal. That while there are many instances of censorship on campus, when you compare it to the number of students on campus, to the number of campuses, it's actually not that severe. FIRE wanted to get hard data on whether or not this is happening. And so along with YouGov, we took a survey of 1,250 undergraduates that was administered by YouGov and funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And here's what we found. I want to highlight just some of the interesting points from it. On a positive note, 87% of students they answered yes to the statement, or they said they agreed with the statement. In my college classes, I feel comfortable sharing my ideas and opinions. And they didn't vary much across lines of race or gender. But when it came to ideology, we started to see a difference that very liberal students are 14 points more likely to feel comfortable sharing those opinions than their very conservative peers. And unfortunately, that high number, the general high number though there, is even less of a reason to rejoice when you consider that more than half of the students surveyed, 54%, said they had stopped themselves from sharing an idea or opinion in a class at some point during college. Why did the students hold back? 53% of them who did indicated they were worried about being incorrect or mistaken. Another 20% shared concern that they would be given lower grades by their professors. Disturbingly, in considering culture, 48% said they were afraid that they would be judged by their peers. And that starts to look like an awful lot of incidents in which students think they have a good point to make, but don't make it for fear of peer pressure. Probably most alarming because of its sheer avoidability, though, is the 16% of students there who have self-censored inside the classroom, at least in part because they feared professors or fellow students would report them to campus employees. Combined with self-censorship due to peer pressure, it turns out that a substantial number of students have been holding back their views, even in class, for fear of facing some sort of retribution. Now, thus far, we've talked about student attitudes regarding their own speech, but the picture actually looks different and unfortunately worse when we look at student attitudes towards others' speech. More than half of students, 58%, agreed with the statement that, quote, it is important to be part of a campus community where I'm not exposed to intolerant and offensive ideas. There is an ideological difference here, with 63% of very liberal students and 45% of very conservative students feeling this way. But in terms of percentages, it's not as wide a gap as today's culture warriors might have guessed. Again, though, that top line number conceals some very real differences in what sort of speech counts as comfortable. For instance, while there's no legal definition of hate speech in our nation, and most of what people call hate speech is protected by the First Amendment, only 24% of liberal students believe that so-called hate speech should be protected compared to very conservative students. Yet when it comes to another constitutionally protected form of speech, campus protest, 64% of very conservative students agree that they, quote, should not have to walk past student protests on campus, while only 17% of liberal students agree. This poses a severe problem for those who believe that if campuses can just get speech regulations just right, they can get rid of the bad speech while still allowing the good. The fact is, while students often agree that there is good and bad speech, their definitions of good and bad often conflict. And just briefly in the time remaining, I want to highlight one more set of findings from the study. Given how much controversy we've seen in recent years around guest speakers visiting campuses, from conservative provocateurs to the first female head of the IMF, some colleges have suggested that bringing in outside speakers is simply no longer worth the trouble. For example, the University of South Carolina decreed that henceforth the university president would be the commencement speaker every year, thereby dodging the political bullet entirely. And after the riot at Berkeley last year during Milo Yiannopoulos' abortive attempt to speak on that campus, the college spent a shocking $600,000 to secure the campus for a visit from conservative speaker Ben Shapiro. Given that a university should be a place where students have access to all sorts of differing perspectives, are controversial speakers a luxury that campuses can afford to lose? Our survey indicated that the answer to this question is a resounding no. First of all, it would be enormously unpopular. 92% of students felt that having the opportunity to hear diverse guest speakers is important. And I think the survey made the reason for that clear. Guest speakers often serve to challenge students' deeply held beliefs or introduce students to new ways of thinking about the world. And they are amazingly successful in doing so. 64% of students admit that they changed, quote, changed at least one of my attitudes, perspectives, or opinions after hearing a guest speaker. This high number suggests not only that guest speakers bring valuable perspectives, but that students probably have not been sufficiently exposed to these perspectives through the campus culture alone, if so many have changed their minds on that issue after a single speech. It's also reason to be deeply concerned that despite their value, more than half of students, 56%, agree that there are instances wherein a college should disinvite a speaker, though again, there is widespread disagreement among who just who should be disinvited. And this short-sighted mode of thinking among students is contrary to the principles of liberal education. It deprives students of an opportunity not just to have their minds changed, but also of the chance to have their arguments strengthened by exposure to new ideas. And we're glad to see the Department of Justice is taking an interest in this very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And welcome again to Lee Tyner. You have a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And I was asked to share some thoughts from the perspective of a general counsel and a campus leader with the responsibility for advising universities on campus speech. In the few minutes I have today, I want to discuss three things. First, I'd like to consider whether we are actually facing some acute crisis, something different today than we've faced for a long time with respect to campus speech. Second, I would like to discuss three challenges that universities face in dealing with expression, especially offensive speech or what some people call hate speech. And third, I'd like to share some insight into campus culture and talk about what actually works in dealing with campus expression. So, are we facing a crisis? Sorry, my technology's giving me troubles, as it always does. I'll eventually learn. We've all read and have heard today about troubling real-world cases of someone facing consequences in the academy for breaking with orthodoxy or expressing unpopular views. We can find examples where the values of diversity and inclusion are used to shut down debate. We should not minimize or explain away these troubling examples, but can we draw any broad conclusions from these anecdotes? When we look at the daily life of colleges and universities, what are the facts? Universities provide resources and support for hundreds of student groups organized around a wide range of religious beliefs, political ideologies, causes, interests, identities, affinities, activities, and hobbies. If we just look at my new home state of Texas, Texas Christian University, at Texas Christian University, students belong to more than 250 student groups, and at the University of Texas, more than 1,300 student groups receive some measure of access or support from the university. Each day at more than 4,000 colleges and universities in this country, there are hundreds and thousands of classroom lectures, assignments, and discussions about every controversial subject under the sun. In a given week, there are thousands more extracurricular activities, lectures, down hall meetings, sermons, performances, and exhibits dealing with difficult topics. Not to mention student protests or expression by outside groups or uninvited speakers. For the most part, these occur without incident. Just by way of example, from several years ago, in the space of just more than a week at the University of Mississippi, we hosted Salman Rushdie, the King of Jordan, and Spike Lee. Within a few semesters of that same week, the university hosted a presidential debate and invited interest groups as diverse as the ACLU and the NRA to set up shop in Issues Alley on the day of the debate, giving each group an opportunity to speak to the assembled crowd. We also dealt with the demonstration by the Klan in full regalia on the same day we hosted a football game against LSU. That was a day in the life of a public university. The point, we can find anecdotes to support any narrative we prefer, but I don't think the lived experiences on campuses or the objective data establish that we are facing a crisis, at least with respect to formal university actions, policies, or decisions. Frankly, we'd be hard-pressed to find any civic institutions better than universities and colleges when it comes to civil discourse on issues that divide us. Frankly, it's not surprising that when we experience First Amendment conflicts in our country, those conflicts are most likely to occur where speech and debate are most likely to occur, on college campuses. So, if we must be careful not to make broad generalizations based on anecdotes, what are the objective facts? What does the data tell us? Well, FIRE, the group led by my colleague on the panel, Robert Shibley, rates university policies. He mentioned this to you a minute ago with respect to free speech. And clearly there's a lot of work to be done. But according to FIRE, we have more institutions with green lights and fewer with red lights today than ever before. In other words, university policies with respect to speech are more consistent with the First Amendment principles today than they were last year or the year before. FIRE also tracks the disinvitation incidents that we've heard so much about in the last few years. They've tracked them for about 7 years, and they've ranged from a low of 6 to a high of 24 in 2016. They dropped to 21 last year, with only 5 reported so far in 2018. Given the number of speakers each year on the campuses of more than 4,000 institutions, we're talking about microscopic numbers. Again, that doesn't mean the individual instances don't deserve attention and maybe even legal action to enforce the laws, but it does not a crisis make. For more than 40 years, based on more than 40 years of data gathered through the General Social Survey, we see that overall support for free speech has risen over time, and that those who earn college degrees support First Amendment rights more strongly than those who have not spent time on campuses. This and other studies suggest that attending college increases one's commitment to First Amendment values. So I think part of what you hear up here is trying to define what the issue really is. Is the issue a culture of victimhood, as Ms. McDonald discussed, or a drift towards authoritarianism that both sides of the debate are comfortable with, or the self-censorship noted by Mr. Shibley? Is it a lack of viewpoint diversity in the academy? Are those the issues that we're most concerned about? Are we concerned about the formal use of power by universities to suppress offensive or unpopular but protected expression? If the concern is the latter, I do not see a crisis. Which brings me to my second point. While I don't think we face a crisis on campus with respect to violations of First Amendment rights, we can have other discussions about viewpoint diversity and those things. Universities do face real challenges managing and protecting speech, in particular offensive speech. As someone on the front lines trying to manage a campus, I'll mention 3. First, when it comes to offensive but protected expression, what many call hate speech, universities are on the horns of a legal dilemma. Universities have a legal obligation under Title VI and Title IX to protect students from a hostile environment. That's something we saw the Department of Education talking about in the recent Rutgers case that was talked about by Mr. Volokh, or Professor Volokh. So we have the obligation to protect students from a hostile environment, and universities are under a similar duty under Title VII to protect employees. In fostering a marketplace of ideas, universities are under a duty, for public universities a constitutional duty, not to punish protected expression. In discharging these competing duties, many commentators suggest that universities cannot and should not prohibit harassing speech until it has actually created a hostile environment. But if a university is indifferent to harassing speech and allows a hostile environment to develop, the university has breached its duty under Title VI or Title IX, or perhaps under Title VII. The university must pick its poison. The university is either liable to the speaker for prohibiting harassing speech before it creates a hostile environment, or the university is liable to the target of harassment for failing to stop the harassing conduct before it has created a hostile environment. An impossible task to fulfill one duty without creating liability for breaching the other. The second challenge that facing universities concerns provocateurs, people who do not come to campus to engage our students or our community in civil discourse or to advance dialogue or debate, but who use our campuses as a foil or a stage to draw attention. Supporters and opponents come dressed for battle, not to exchange ideas, but to exchange blows. The players in these dramas are not always members of our campus communities, but outside groups hoping to use our campuses as a theatrical backdrop or to become a martyr in the culture wars. In these cases, our security costs are not related to the protests or counter-protests by members of the academic community, but by people who come to our campus to fight. All agree that protecting the campus community from violence is a compelling state interest. Last year, the University of California at Berkeley spent nearly $4 million on security for free speech events over the course of the month of September. So how much should a university be required to spend in providing a stage for provocateurs? Or stated differently, how much more should a student have to spend in tuition so a provocateur may use a campus to grab headlines? Is there any limit? Those security issues and what we do about those situations are real challenges faced by universities. The third challenge has to do with our students. One of my former provosts used to say, we teach to a parade. Each year we admit new classes of 18-year-olds who are not fully formed and have not considered many of the civic values and core principles of a free society that we hold dear. Many of these students are from homogenous, non-diverse backgrounds. If we do our jobs really well and we mold the freshman class into resilient citizen scholars ready to meet the challenges of the academy today and the real world tomorrow, we have a whole new batch of freshmen the next year. We start over. When we recruit these students to campus and welcome them into our communities, we communicate the campus's core values around respect for the individual and collegiality. We tell them we're a community, a family. We tell them we value difference and diversity. We tell them our campus is their campus, their new home. So when someone comes into the living room of their new home and spews divisive, discredited, racist, or ideas, many of those students don't understand how, in light of our values, we can allow speech to take place. Students conflate our allowing a speaker to use university facilities with some sort of imprimatur or approval, which leads us to some best practices in dealing with offensive speech. First and foremost, universities must do what universities do best: teach. We must teach the importance of a robust marketplace of ideas for intellectual inquiry. We must teach that the push for diversity in higher education itself has always been grounded, especially in terms of legal analysis, in the notion of the marketplace of ideas, that we need people from different backgrounds and perspectives in the classroom so that we may glean the educational benefits of a diverse learning environment. We must teach students to expect to be confronted with new and uncomfortable ideas that demand reflection and self-examination. We must teach students that the best remedy for bad ideas, even hateful or offensive ideas, is more ideas. To that end, some institutions are reimagining orientation in the first-year curriculum, particularly programming aimed at introducing students to the academy and campus life. Universities are addressing expectations with respect to expression, promoting resilience, and teaching the importance of First Amendment values. Purdue University is a leader on this front and a good example if you want to see what some universities are doing. Second, a second best practice for universities that manage offensive speakers most effectively: they use incidents of hate or intolerance as teachable moments. Faculty and student life professionals advise students on how to make their voices heard, how to join issue with the ideas that offend. Faculty organize opportunities to debate the issues in a meaningful way. Universities teach students the importance of surfacing and confronting pernicious ideas rather than forcing them underground. Faculty help students organize meaningful counter-protests, promoting the values of the university community. Students must learn that offensive speech and extremist speakers often generate discussion, debate, and reflection that lead to tremendous personal and community growth. But in defending free speech, and this is important, especially the rights of others to spread hateful, pernicious ideas, we must never act like hate speech is benign. We must never dismiss students as snowflakes because they feel subjective injury when they're exposed to virulent, toxic, or divisive ideas. The old adage, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," is the biggest lie our mothers ever told us. We do not protect speech because it does no harm or because hate poses no threat in the marketplace of ideas. Quite the contrary. We protect speech and we protect ideas because ideas are powerful. And we have to remember that when we say speech is free, we do not mean it has no cost. In dealing with our students, we must remember that the cost of offensive speech is disproportionately borne by historically underrepresented minorities and marginalized peoples. We must acknowledge and tend to pain, fear, and loss among those students if they are going to persist in higher education. We must acknowledge that some ideas are malevolent and dangerous, which, although free to be expressed, which leads me to another best practice with respect to universities that handle these issues well. Even as we seek to remedy and combat the impact of hate speech, we must help students understand why we may not do so by punishing the speaker. While that's a tool in our toolbox that we do not have, we must help students understand why we have chosen as a culture and as a society not to give those in authority, like me on a campus, the power to punish unpopular speech. The power to punish unpopular speech rarely works out well for the underrepresented or the marginalized, the reformer or the revolutionary. Finally, if we tell students that the best remedy for offensive speech is more speech rather than prohibition, then universities must use our words. The best universities know how to protect the speaker while joining issue with the idea expressed. They know how to allow speech without suggesting all ideas have equal merit. They know how to vindicate and promote all the academic community's values, opposing hate and dangerous notions of authoritarianism while protecting the rights of others to hold and express those same discredited notions. One last thought. The First Amendment gets it right. We don't need more rules. We have the tools we need when there are incidents of universities misusing power. Rules will not change the hearts or minds of anyone. They will not lead to more viewpoint diversity on our faculties or win any ideological battles in the marketplace of ideas. We really appreciate the opportunity to have a voice from the campus.
Thank you. We really appreciate you providing that voice here today. Now, Mr. Tyner has raised a number of issues that I'd like to hear from our other panelists on, and we'll go in the same order in which we did the opening remarks. So we'll start with you, Professor Volek. But let me just rephrase the question as I understood Mr. Tyner to have phrased it. Do you agree that there's no free speech crisis on campus, as Mr. Tyner alleged or asserted? And what is the issue we're really discussing here today? What's the underlying nub of the matter when it comes to this question of free speech on campus?
Well, look, let's keep a sense of proportion. As between North Koreans having nuclear bomb and campus speech codes, I'm more worried about the former. There are lots of other things. I'm more worried about socialism than I am about campus speech codes. There are lots of things to be worried about. But I wouldn't say it's a crisis as such, but I would say that universities have been both restricting speech, chilling speech, in the sense that the real danger with the speech codes isn't that they're enforced. It's that they don't need to be enforced because the students are too afraid to talk. And also, and this is one thing that I agree with, I think several of the panelists on, part of the problem is that even without outright suppression of student speech or speaker speech, there are lots of topics that aren't discussed on campuses. Abortion, for example, is something that divides the country more or less in half, although it's actually somewhat more complicated than that. My sense is that in my own UCLA Law School, I don't recall a single event over the last 20-some years, and memory's imperfect, but pretty sure there were very, very few, if any, where there was a serious debate about abortion. And even students who are for abortion rights, as a result, aren't really being well prepared for discussing this issue. And a university as a whole, my sense is, very rarely discusses those things. That's actually more of a problem, although the thing is, it's also a problem that is harder to fight, precisely because it's not something to be fought through legal channels or through channels of constitutional challenges. I do think also universities should be careful about condemning things as hate speech. I agree. If Nazis come to campus, I think it's perfectly proper for the university to say, Nazis are bad, the Ku Klux Klan is bad. I'd say the same thing about the revolutionary communists who come periodically, although universities generally don't. Maybe they don't actually need to because it's pretty obvious to many people, but sometimes it may feel better. It may make people feel better to say that. The problem is, it's interesting to hear some of the things. So I recall, I'm trying to get this right, condemning virulent, toxic, and divisive speech. It's interesting how things, whether you intended to have it be as broad as that, but it's very easy for things to flow from one to the other. Well, toxic. Well, that's bad. We don't like anything that's toxic, right? Well, divisive. Well, lots of speech is divisive. Much of it is constitutionally protected. Much of it I don't think the university should speak out on. For example, if somebody says something about current politics, sharply condemns the president or sharply condemns his opposition, I don't think the university should step in and say, well, no, this is very bad. I mean, I suppose if it advocates violence in an explicit sense, maybe, if it's sort of full of vulgarity, I suppose the university could say, for whatever it's worth and probably be worth very little, look, guys, just talk about it more politely. But I don't think we really think that all divisive ideas should be suppressed. Well, there's a lot of discussion of race from the left, which is divisive, talk about white privilege and the like. You know, some of it may be accurate. Some of the discussion of race from the right may be accurate. It's hard to tell for sure, but I don't think we should, the moment somebody says, oh, this is divisive, try to suppress it. And I don't think even some people who use that label mean that. What they mean is certain kinds of divisive speech. But the problem is we see that this attempt to suppress speech is used with regard to anti-abortion speech, with regard to anti-affirmative action speech, with regard to speech as to whether people should be required to use certain pronouns as the subjects of the pronouns prefer. And if the university takes the occasion every time to speak out about that, you know, I think it may be within its rights to do that. But I think it itself may be dangerous to public debate. So I think that while it's valuable for the university to speak out about certain things, there's the danger of kind of demand creep. Well, you spoke out against the Nazis. Why aren't you speaking out against the anti-same-sex marriage people? They're just as bad as the Nazis, aren't they? Many people do believe that. And then what you get is that you have the university using its considerable power, including its power that people know over their employees, staff, and students, to sharply condemn something and send the message, even without outright suppression, that this is the sort of thing that if you value your career, you maybe better avoid. So I'm not saying universities should never speak out about such things, but I think there's a danger, especially when things are defined in as broad a way as divisive or virulent or even toxic, when the universities do speak out.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, your thoughts, and if you have any thoughts on the issue Professor Volokh just raised about whether universities really are equipped to define terms like divisive and toxic and enforce those in some kind of even-handed way.
Well, Mr. Tyner was very scrupulous in claiming that there was not a problem with the attempt to stifle non-orthodox views on campus, and dismissing instances I could add to. These are all liberal professors and speakers who have been silenced. Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College, Nicholas Christakis at Yale, Suzanne Goldberg at Columbia, James Comey at Howard, the president of University of Oregon, Michael Schill. Rutgers tried to shut down Mark Lilla and Camille Foster. American University canceled a panel on feminism. And yet he speaks very broadly about this alleged parade of speakers that are spewing, in his words, divisive racist ideas, that they are that they're spewing hate speech. I don't know who he's referring to. The provocateur phrase may apply to Milo Yiannopoulos and I suppose Ann Coulter, but the people who have been put under the hate speech category are people like Ben Shapiro, completely mainstream academic, Amy Wax at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, who's going to speak at the next panel, one of the most respected legal scholars in the country. These are not, and me, I'm not defending here, I'm not playing the victim, but I speak about minority support for the police in high crime neighborhoods. I don't think this is hate speech. I think that to even give validity to that rhetoric, that somehow campuses are experiencing this parade of people spewing racist ideas, is already part of the problem. He says that universities are the best at managing civil conflicts. Well, maybe that's only because this victimology is already rapidly starting to spread into civil society, as exemplified by the firing of computer scientist James Damore from Google in August of 2017. Damore had written a fact-based, reasonable memo challenging the reigning feminist orthodoxy at Google. And in firing him, Google's CEO used the identical language, the bathos-drenched victimology language from campuses, saying that Google's employees were hurting because Damore had presented a set of arguments about why there's not 50-50 gender parity at Google, that is not because of sexism on the part of engineers. Even more worrisome than Google firing Damore was the fact that an associate general counsel at the National Labor Relations Board wrote a memo upholding the firing on the ground that this memo constituted harassment and sexual discrimination. So we are now seeing this equation of rational argument with injurious hate speech moving into the non-academic civil society. I think this is something to be very worried about. The universities are spreading this model. And I would also disagree with the emphasis on, again, to use the term hate speech is already to take a position in this debate, because apart from the white supremacist rally at the University of Virginia, I do not know of any speakers who have been engaged in hate speech on campuses, as that term could possibly be reasonably defined. But to say that we want to focus on the costs borne by historically marginalized minorities of hate speech, I think gets it exactly backwards. It's the costs of censorship that have been historically borne by marginalized minorities. Centralized power, whether it's from the state or from an institution like a university, is used not to hurt the majority, but to hurt the minorities. And it is the freedom of speech, the power to challenge, to speak truth to power, that has brought down regimes. Do we want to silence Martin Luther King? Do we want to silence Frederick Douglass? Or do we believe in the power of rhetoric and persuasion to challenge hegemonic power? So I think, again, the core problem here is the victimology narrative, but is definitely having consequences in how we define speech. And just to finish, as Eugene properly brought up, to say, well, we haven't seen 6 dozen instances of somebody challenging racial preferences being shouted down, that is because there is a massive informal censorship going on campuses. Most professors have their heads down. There are a very few remarkably courageous students who are willing to stand up and challenge the orthodoxies, but I can guarantee you, I can promise you, that fewer and fewer people are willing to subject themselves to what Brett Weinstein and Nicholas Christakis experienced at Yale and Evergreen State University.
If I can just respond very briefly, we're really in furious agreement about the need to protect all speech, including offensive speech, and why that's important for people out who don't have power more than for anyone else. What I'm talking about is a very discrete issue, and that is there an epidemic, a crisis of universities using hard power to punish speech in violation of the First Amendment? That is a different question than whether there is a developing cultural problem of a culture of victimhood. That's a very different question. And I want to suggest that we should form conclusions about whether First Amendment rights are being violated based upon data and based upon long-term data, not based upon anecdotes, because we can always find anecdotes to support our propositions. And every one of those anecdotes where we talk about someone's rights being violated are serious and should be taken seriously. And when there's a violation of the law, the DOJ should be looking at whether they should take a position. But that does not mean that we have an epidemic of universities using formal power in violation of the First Amendment. that's where I think we need to be careful about drawing conclusions based on anecdotes rather than data.
Well, I thank you for that point, and I think that dovetails with my question for you, Robert, which is that Mr. Tyner has pointed to some data from FIRE, including the trend in green light awards or recognition that FIRE has been handing out. So I'm curious on your thoughts. Are you seeing trends in higher education and free speech issues from the perspective of FIRE? What if anything, would you say about the green light, red light data trends that Mr. Tyner has talked about, and about these issues more generally?
Well, I think there are definitely, with respect to written policies, which is what we evaluate for purposes of our speech code policies, there has been a huge improvement, and frankly, a big part of that improvement has been directly due to a whole enormous amount of work by FIRE and other groups. This isn't something that universities have just sort of, come around to by their own. There's been a whole lot of pushing on this. About 10 years ago, it was closer to 80 to 90% of schools were red light speech codes. So we've been able to push that down. I think it was 79%, if I remember correctly, in 2009. That decrease has been the result of a lot of pressure from FIRE and from other groups, from students and professors willing to sue and vindicate their rights on campuses. So there has been progress there, but it's not like it's just been some sort of great awakening of tolerance. It's been a lot of holding people's nose to the grindstone and making them do it. I think with regard to the hard power question that Lee was mentioning, I think that does dovetail a little bit with what Heather was saying, because she said there is this enormous apparatus, this sort of informal apparatus of informal censorship that's happening on college campuses. And while there might not have to be that many Brett Weinsteins, there might not have to be that many Nick Christakises, the thing is, everybody knows about those. And one of the principles behind the way we do free speech and the way we figure out about it is that there's this chilling effect. I've talked to Brett Weinstein at length. This is a person who's been through a lot. He doesn't have another job at a university, and frankly, I'm not sure what the prospects are for him, given that he did nothing wrong, but he's become this cause celebre. Anything he does from now on is going to be, he'll be radioactive if he says or does anything. And I think that's true for a lot of these professors who are willing to come forward. So yeah, the informal censorship does a lot of the work. As to whether or not it's come to a crisis now, I agree with Eugene. That North Korean nukes are definitely much more of a crisis. And I'm the executive director of FIRE, and I'm telling you that, this is not the most important issue in the entire world. It is a very important issue. But is it a crisis or not? I want to be careful. FIRE doesn't usually call it a crisis. But I do think one point that you made, Lee, about the fact that it's costing universities a lot of money, I think, it obviously costs a lot of money to have a free society where people can communicate like that, but it has gotten worse lately. And so I think one of the things that might point toward there being, if not a crisis, kind of an inflection point, is the fact that a few years ago, Berkeley wasn't spending $600,000 to defend the place after Ben Shapiro tries to speak, or in terms of him trying to come. And so I think that there's definitely something has changed on campuses where universities are now saying, oh my goodness, if we want to have something that would have gone off without a hitch before happen now we have to spend huge amounts of money, in order to do that. What's driving that? I would suggest that a lot of it is universities bringing this expectation that there is going to be some kind of filter. You also mentioned, I hate to use your remarks as a punching bag here a little bit, so I feel a little bit bad, but you mentioned, can universities speak out against bad speech? Universities do have rules about speech. They do speak out against speech, what they consider to be bad. I think the reason students, they think it's a home and they think that they're going to be protected from that speech is because the university is saying, hey, you're going to be protected from that speech. We actually agree with you. We're kind of sorry that these people have the right to free speech that they do. And I think that's a lot of what's driving that expectation that students have now. And frankly, I don't think they had 20 years ago, although that might just be my old man cane waving.
Can I ask
Kids
Robert
these
a quick
days.
question?
Yeah.
So do you think there are more uses of hard power that would violate the First Amendment today than 5 years ago on campuses or 10 years ago?
It's hard to know, because one of the things that we do know is that as fire has gotten and the issue has gotten bigger, we get more cases coming in every year. We get more reports of it. So we know that we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, so it's hard to say. I think that actually the uses of hard power have probably, I don't know if the numbers have decreased. I think that they've become a little bit more ambiguous in many ways, a little bit more complicated. But when they do blow up, they've blown up into a huge problem for the people that really has these national reverberations. And frankly, it's not all up to universities. Social media and sort of the echo chamber effect has had a huge part of that. I think that's been driving a lot of it too.
So on that point, Robert, I want to give everyone on the panel an opportunity to pick up on that trend, which I think is a very important one. We've received some questions from the audience, and I'm going to combine a few of these questions into one, but I'm going to read the first sentence of one because it's further proof that we have a university crowd here today. Because it says, university students don't spring into being like Athena when they arrive on campus. So the Athena reference, I think, shows what kind of group we have here today, so thank you for that. But I think it's two different questions I'd like to combine into one and get everybody's viewpoint on, starting with you at the end, Professor Volek. This notion that students come to a university with a set of experiences and with some free-formed, already formed, perhaps, ideas. They also reflect broader social and cultural trends. And of course, we now live in an age of the internet and social media. So to what extent is the issue that we're seeing on campus, because I think everybody agrees with it, that there is an issue with free speech rights on campus, it's just how much of an issue I think we're debating right now. But to what extent does this issue really reflect broader social and cultural and generational trends among students and the power of social media and the internet to magnify speech and lead to some of the group dynamics that Robert was just talking about? And how does that maybe project out even outside of the university environment?
You know, it's very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell why a large group of people or why one person does do what they do. Some people theorize that part of it stems from greater speech restrictions in high schools, in junior high schools. Not greater than in the long past when I think the restrictions back then were even more severe, but greater than, say, in the 70s, shortly after Tinker v. Des Moines Independent School District in the 80s, and that when schools tell kids you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that, then they come and bring that to universities with them. I'm not sure that's right, but that's a possibility. Another possibility, picking up on something that we just heard, is a lot of things in life are crisis of expectations. If you tell students that not only is their offensive speech offensive, but it's a violation of their civil rights to have to hear certain things, then my sense of human nature is it makes it more offensive. That rather than just saying, you know, that guy, that idiot is saying what he's saying, I'm going to try as best I can to ignore it. You'd say, well, how can I ignore it? He's violating my civil rights. It's almost like he's slapping me in the face. I wouldn't ignore that. Well, I shouldn't ignore that either. So it may be indeed that by telling students that they're entitled to this protection, that they are more likely to be offended. The last thing that I want to suggest, and this is not about all students, but it is about the violence and the extra costs, is, I'm not a psychologist, but common life tells us behavior that is rewarded is repeated. If people know that by shouting or by throwing rocks or sometimes just by threatening something, they can get stuff that they dislike suppressed, then they feel, wow, that's cool. I got this stuff I dislike suppressed. I felt powerful from doing that. I got no pushback. I ought to do more of that. And what's more, other people say, well, wait a minute, why can't I get in on the action? If these people are suppressing the speech they dislike, what about me suppressing speech that I dislike? Just to give an example, there was a anti-Israel ad that was removed from, or that was rejected by, I think, Seattle Transit Authority. Because some people, I think it was like maybe one or two, sent threats. If you keep up this ad, I will vandalize the bus. Ooh, we're going to take it down, says the authority. Well, you know, Those people probably got the message from some other things that they'd heard in the news of how some speech that they disliked was being effectively suppressed that way, and other people will get the message from this. So I think when it comes to the particular kind of suppression, not indeed by the university directly as such, but possibly by the university refusing to allow certain speakers because of security costs, or just the university having to spend a lot of money, which you're right, we wish they didn't have to spend. Part of it is maybe that they didn't spend enough back then. They didn't do enough in order to punish the students who were acting violently or who were shouting people down. And by doing that, they led others to feel, well, this is something that will achieve my goals.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, I'd like to give you an opportunity to chime in on this. I think you have some views on these broader social and cultural issues, and maybe even the social media point.
Well, as I understood the question, it's what's causing this, and I would argue again that it is the rise of a ever more delusional victimology on campuses. Let me give you an example. Minority students occupied the president's office at Brown University several years ago and said, well, it's too hard to have to show up on time on colleges because we're, quote, so focused on staying alive at Brown. Now, I'm sorry, this is completely hyperbolic and delusional. No student at Brown is at risk of his life. And yet that sort of maudlin, just hysterical rhetoric is now the currency of the realm. And we are teaching favored victim groups on campuses to think of themselves as existential threat, and the demand to shut down what is then deemed hate speech, which is anything that challenges campus orthodoxies, grows out of that claim to be at existential risk. Hate speech is, we have a few other alchemical transactions that go on. This was exemplified by an op-ed published by a professor and administrator at NYU, Ulrich Beyer, several years ago at the New York Times, that talked about hate speech causing literal damage to minorities, and if you're already at risk of survival, then the idea that speech is action, that speech becomes a form of behavior, and this was rhetoric that was used by the Middlebury faculty as a reason for shutting down Charles Murray, something that resulted in a Middlebury professor getting pummeled so she got a concussion, had to wear a neck brace for months, Allison Stanger. The idea that hate speech is a form of action and therefore can be shut down grows out of this narrative of the oppression of females and underrepresented minorities on campuses. And that's why I argue that we are not going to be able to open up the ability to challenge campus orthodoxies unless we take on that core problem.
Lee, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Sure. I think to determine if we see something different in students today, we need more longitudinal data like the sort that Robert and Fire gathered, and that like we've seen from the Knight Foundation and Pew and others. We need more longitudinal data to determine if there's actual change or some difference in the attitudes of students towards speech over time, rather than just a snapshot or two, to really determine if our students are different today than yesterday. We need to look at data. I will. One of the reasons I cited the General Society survey, I think that was the name of it, because we have a lot of data over many years since the early 70s, and it suggests that our society is more open to speech and expression today than it was yesterday, and that college graduates are more open than people who never attended college. I read somewhere this week, and I couldn't find it when I was preparing my remarks, about a study of UCLA freshmen and seniors that I think was repeated in the same cohort, and their attitudes towards free expression became more consistent with Fourth Amendment values during their time at UCLA again, if I remember that reporting correctly. That was a very small cohort. Don't know how much meaning to place in it, but I think we need data to figure that out. What's happening? Do our students leave with a better expectation and understanding of the value of why we don't punish offensive speech? Do they leave with different attitudes than what they come in with? And are they coming in with different attitudes today than 5 years ago or 5 years from now? I think we need more data.
Great. Let me ask a question, yet another from the audience here, that I think brings a lot of these issues into focus. Because one thing that Mr. Tyner has said is that universities are concerned, and rightly so, about protecting underrepresented minorities and others who may come into an environment and feel hostility. And they may even view the entire debate about free speech to be something hostile to members of underrepresented minority groups. There may be members of those groups who think that all the talk about free speech is just to justify speech that's critical of them and not critical of the majority. So with that framing in mind, let me ask this question. It's really two hypotheticals, and I'm going to start with you, Robert, and see what you think on this. Was it appropriate for Oklahoma President David Boren to expel fraternity members for singing a racist song?
No.
All righty. What, if any, circumstances should permit a college to discipline a student who calls another student, an African-American student, by the N-word?
Well, that's a little bit more complicated question. With regard to President Boren's decision to, I believe, not just disband the fraternity, kick everybody out of their fraternity house within, I believe 48 hours. They had the letters down, all because several people were filmed on a bus, not everybody on the bus, on this fraternity party bus of some kind, singing what was acknowledgedly an extremely sort of hair-raisingly racist song. That was such a clear example of guilt by association, and not only is that protected speech. Racist songs are protected speech. They wasn't aimed at somebody there. That just simply doesn't rise to the level of unprotected speech. And University of Oklahoma is a public university. So he was not justified in doing that, and Fire condemned that very loudly when it happened. I can only imagine how I would feel. There were people on another bus. I can only imagine how I'd feel if I was one of the people on the other bus and was thrown out of my home and kicked out of my school for people on the other bus singing the song that I may not even have known about. So no, when it comes to, when simply using the words becomes something for which you could move to discipline, it has to rise to the standard of discriminatory harassment under the Supreme Court's decision in Davis from 1999. And so simply using a word one time or even several times is not going to be enough. It needs to be a pattern of harassing behavior. Generally a pattern. If it's very, very severe one time, it could be a one-time thing like a sexual assault. But it has to be a pattern of harassing behavior that's so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively keeps the victims, a student, from getting their education at that school. I'm eliding a little bit there, but it's a high standard because the reason when it's peer-on-peer stuff, which I believe is what you're talking about here, it'd be one thing if it was a professor or administrator saying that. Then you've got other issues there of just employee discipline. In that case, if they're calling people that, students aren't in a position generally of having power over one another. A lot of what makes harassment discriminatory is the power relationship of one person over the other. And so if a student calls me a bad name, if they call me, whether or not it has to do with my race or with my political beliefs, which, frankly, people are called bad names because of their political beliefs all the time now, that's, that in itself doesn't rise to the level of harassment. So I would say that if it raises to that standard and the university, would have to investigate that and establish that, then yes, they could be punished. But just simply uttering the word, we had a case where a professor at Brandeis was explaining the use of the term wetback, and because somebody asked him about it in class. And he was disciplined by the university. So the professor had been there for about 50 years. Ended up I believe he just ended up having to retire through the whole mess just to sort of make it go away. So you can't let the tripwire for it just be that low a level.
Professor Volokh, what do you think on this question, and how have you maybe seen this play out in your experience?
Sure. There's a reason that historically people on the left, but people all over, have worried about the slippery slope. I have to warn you, I wrote a 100-page long, literally, I'm sorry to say, Harvard Law Review article 15 years ago, so I'm going to try to condense it a little bit. But the bottom line is that once a particular kind of legal rule is accepted, there are going to be consequences from it outside of the original situation. There are lots of mechanisms through which this happens, but we see that. Just to give an example from a different area that I think many of you might have thought about elsewhere, but it's precisely because it's different, it's a different kind of debate, is privacy. That one particular form of surveillance may be very modest, but it's used as a precedent for other forms of surveillance, and then still others. I do think we have less privacy now than before. Maybe for good reason. Maybe dangers require surrender of that. But I think if you look at the history of surveillance and restrictions on privacy from, say, the 60s to the present, we see some of that slippery slope. The same thing happens with regard to university speech, university student speech. That once you accept the proposition that somebody, even for off-campus speech, talking to friends, can be expelled because he uses a racist slur. You know, maybe you could say, well, it'll only be limited to racist slurs, but why should we think that? Why wouldn't we infer that what's going to happen is other people will say, well, wait a minute, he used an anti-Semitic slur, anti-gay slur. Isn't that the same? Aren't we entitled to the same protection? Yes, say the universities. Well, he didn't exactly use the slur. He didn't call me a kike. He called me a Zionist pig, or he didn't even call me. He complained, because this did not involve any targeting, Zionist pigs. Well, lots of Jews understandably view that as code word for kike or for something along those lines, kind of the modern version. And then you get something like the Office for Civil Rights statements that, well, if you harshly condemn Israel, then that's certainly many Jews perceive that as an attack, especially in light of what they see as many physical violent attacks on Jews in Israel and elsewhere, thankfully very few in America. So this is the way things happen. In a legal system built on analogy and precedent, tempting as it is to say, well, these are different, these are communists, these are Nazis, they're different, we're going to have a separate rule for them and it's not going to spread. It's hard to keep it from spreading. That's why I think even really nasty speech needs to continue to be protected. Especially, not only, but especially, again, once we get to a point where off-campus speech, it could have just as well been at a party. It could have just as well been over dinner if somebody had recorded it or overheard it. Once you get to the point where people can be expelled from the university for that, then the door is wide open, to mix a metaphor.
Yeah, if I can just add, I ask progressives, do you trust Donald Trump to define hate speech and apply the sanctions on you? I assume the answer is no. So do not assume that you are always going to be in power, which you are now certainly on the university campuses, to be able to control that extraordinary principle, to be able to silence your enemies. Because believe me, Donald Trump would love to use it.
Lee Tyner, I'd like to ask you, building on this hypothetical, do you think that use of the N-word or some of the other words that we've heard up here would qualify as hate speech?
So Robert and I generally agree with what the law says about this. And hate speech is not a useful term at all in trying to determine what's actionable under the law. So it could be clearly hate speech, but it's still protected. Okay, so let's be clear. Hate speech is not useful as a term of art in trying to determine what's actionable or protected speech and what is not, all right? But the question is whether or not the N-word can be used to create a hostile environment. Sure, it can be used to create a hostile environment depending upon the circumstances and whether it's unavoidable for the student, it's a condition of what they have to endure to go to class or to go to their bedroom at night. It depends upon the circumstances and whether it's directed at a person or an individual and what's the context. One of the challenges we face, I alluded to this in my remarks, is the legal standard for when a university has to pay the victim of discrimination for having failed to cure the discrimination is whether or not they've acted with reckless disregard, with deliberate indifference towards harassing conduct that is so severe, pervasive, or objectively, you get the turn of phrase right.
Severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive.
And objectively offensive as to effectively deny a student educational programs or benefits, basically. So that's the standard, right? If we don't cure harassing conduct before it creates a hostile, that we know about, before it creates a hostile environment, we owe the student, we are liable to the student for having failed to cure the harassment. But, at least many suggest, if we have to sit and watch the N-word be used multiple times until it's actually created the hostile environment before we can punish it. That can't be right, right? There has to be some room where the university can walk, where it's neither liable to the speaker nor the victim. There's got to be some space there somewhere. Now, that having been said, the abstract promotion of awful ideas and use of racial slurs in the abstract context of promoting ideas we disagree with does not create a hostile environment under the law. I think Robert and I would agree with both where the tension is and what the law is with respect to that.
Well, we have just 2 minutes remaining. I'd like to give each of our panelists about 30 seconds for any closing thoughts you might have, starting with you, Professor Volek.
I just want to stress one thing that I mentioned before. Free speech has many functions, but one of the most important ones at the university is that it gives us confidence in what is accepted received wisdom. That's true on history, it's true on science, it's true on everything else. Now, the real scholars will tell you we should never have real confidence. Everything should always be up for grabs, and I totally agree with that. But as a practical matter, we as outsiders to a field need to be able to hear, here's some question about whether there are biological cognitive differences and temperamental differences among the sexes. Well, are there or aren't there? Or if there are, what's the magnitude? We can, as outsiders, we need to be able to have sources we turn to. And if we see that there is a conventional wisdom among scholars in a good sense, then we can say, okay, fine, we'll defer to that judgment. But not if we know that there hasn't been free speech both in the university, both among the faculty and among students and among graduate students and everybody else who can say, well, wait, maybe that's not quite right. So long as that process of free speech continues, that is when we can actually have confidence that there are some things that are right, and we can actually measure some of the other speech against it and say, well, this is speech that's false, so we should say it's probably false. Once there is that kind of suppression, it doesn't just undermine speech, it undermines our ability to trust the outputs of the academic enterprise, and that is very dangerous.
Ms. McDonald.
Again, I do not think that we are living through an epidemic of racist acts on campus. We've heard the example of the N-word used on the fraternity bus, but I haven't heard any other examples of that. But I would also say more broadly that we have two choices. We can live in a world where we resolve our differences through reason, through rhetoric, through efforts at persuasion, or we have a world where force is used. There's really no middle ground. Whether that force is implicit in both an informal censorship of disfavored ideas, formal censorship, or, as we've seen in the last several years, the use of literal violence to try and shut down speech. That's our alternative. So I think that we need to be completely unequivocal in the idea that anything short of threats of physical violence, those disagreements have to be resolved through other ideas that challenge them. We cannot lose our confidence in the power of reason, in the Enlightenment values that have given us so much prosperity, freedom, and progress. And so to go down the road of carving out exceptions for hate speech, I think, is very dangerous. Again, though, let me reaffirm what really colleges are about is the transmission of knowledge. And these things that we're talking about here are on the surface, and what they are about is the passing on of an inheritance.
Mr. Shidley.
There's a man we had speak at a conference for Fire last year. His name is Daryl Davis, and he is a African American musician. And his, I guess maybe you'd call it a hobby, is befriending members of the Ku Klux Klan. He goes to Klan rallies, he befriends members, and he tries to relate with them as a person. And so far, he has convinced dozens of them to leave the Klan. They give him his robe. He has a whole collection of KKK robes from people who are quitting. The reason I bring this person up and the reason we brought him to Fire is because the key to trying to deal with this bad speech, and I think there's because campuses are a more diverse place and they are a place that there's much more ferment right now than maybe there was in past years, although certainly not from the 1960s, is because we've given up, it seems, on persuading instead of coercing. There seems to be this sort of intellectual virus that's gotten in, this idea that if nobody ever hears something bad, if they don't hear that somebody doesn't like black people, if they don't hear anti-Semitism, that it wouldn't occur to them normally. And what I would suggest is that, I don't know whether or not that's true or not, but I do know that persuading somebody to change their mind is going to be a lot more effective than trying to make sure that they're never exposed to that topic. And so I think to the extent that universities and other cultural institutions are currently making this effort to make it so that we're not persuading you, we're not letting other people persuade, but we're going to actually, ban your speech if you step over the line, that's been a huge mistake.
And Mr. Tyner.
Well, I'd say a couple things. One is we need to encourage universities and faculty members to don't grow weary of doing good. I mean, and by that I mean they have new students every year who come from environments where they've not confronted ideas that they're uncomfortable with, where they've not been required to, and they don't have an appreciation necessarily of our civic institutions or the values that are important to the maintenance of our civic institutions. And that's one of the key roles of universities. And again, I think the data shows that universities actually move the needle in a favorable way on those key things, and that college graduates have more favorable views towards free expression and value those ideals more than the rest of our society. So we can't grow weary of that notion, and we can't act like the fact that new 18-year-olds come next year who are not fully formed, and some hold racist views, and some who don't value the First Amendment. The fact that that's true, we can't let that discourage us or somehow make us think that we're failing. That's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is the same thing I say when I'm speaking to campus professionals or student life professionals at other conferences or on my own campuses. Many of the most sublime days on a campus that I've seen in my career have been when hateful, offensive speakers come to our campus. And it's because our students think and our students engage, and they struggle with what it means, and they learn about free expression, and they learn about and they begin to have more meaningful conversations than they otherwise would have that day on campus. So I've always viewed it as something of a great day when we successfully have speakers that are very controversial, because it inevitably leads to advancement in the citizen scholars on our campus and how they think and engage with the world. So I try to encourage campuses not to fear offensive speakers coming to campus, but to take advantage of when they come.
Please join me in thanking John and our panelists for that outstanding discussion. Thank you very much.